right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Clinical Trials Community of Practice session today. I'm delighted to introduce Sue Siminski, who is the CEO of Frontier Science and Technology Research Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provides innovative clinical trial data management and statistical analysis services. Many investigators at UW have had the good fortune of working closely with Frontier Science and Technology over the years. For over 30 years, Sue has served in a variety of leadership roles, increasing the range of services and solutions provided by her organization. She's also made longstanding contributions to HIV/AIDS and cancer research, and most importantly, I think for our group here in the audience, has also contributed to and led several NIH-funded coordinating centers. So we are delighted to welcome you, Sue, and really looking forward to your talk today.
Thank you, Nasia, for those kind words. And thank you to the organizers and my colleague, Kim, for inviting me to give a talk today. I'm hoping that by the end of this, if you don't already have an appreciation for the importance of validating data collection instruments, you will have gained that from this presentation. And so I'd like to start off by giving some background of Frontier Science Foundation as an overview. As Nasia said, we have a longstanding relationship with University of Wisconsin. We're very proud of. But for Frontier Science, we're a not-for-profit statistical and data management organization focused on medical research. We were established in 1975 in Amherst, New York. And one of the main reasons for that, which is Amherst is a suburb right outside of Buffalo, but relevant to all of you at Wisconsin, is to support the Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group's data management needs at the request of Dr. Paul Carbone, who was the ECOG group chair at the time and the director of the University of Wisconsin Cancer Coordinating Center, is one of the big reasons why our office was established with our then president, Dr. Marvin Zelen. And we've carried that relationship through, as you'll see further in the presentation. So strong roots our organizations working together. So I do lead the organization. I've been at Frontier Science for the past 30 years in various positions. I not only lead the organization, but I also run and PI several NIH projects. The mission of Frontier is to advance the application of statistical science and practice, data management techniques in science, healthcare, and education. Our main areas of activities, for those that don't know, is that we participate in clinical trials. This is all phases, observational studies. We also do regulatory submission work. Our trials range from single site, single study to long-term international multi-site, multi-study networks. Our biostatistics expertise and statistical programming we have in our Frontier Science organization. We have statistical leadership that we support the IDMC reporting and other study monitoring. This is exclusively out of our Madison, Wisconsin office. We also do database design and management, as well as data collection management and monitoring. Our offices, we have 3 offices located in the United States, one Amherst, New York, again, right outside of Buffalo. This is where I am based. We have a Boston office, Massachusetts office. We have one in Madison, Wisconsin. Again, they exclusively do IDMC support work. And then we have 2 affiliates, one in Athens, Greece, and one in King Craig, Scotland. And just from additional background, many of our projects are international multi-site, multi-study projects funded by the NIH. We centralize data collection for these projects. We maintain a central database. We clean, standardize if the project's following, such as the Clinical Data Interchange Standards Consortium, also known as CDISC. We prepare data for analysis. We also build our own software and license commercial software. We've built our own remote data capture system, but more projects, as you'll see, are moving more to a commercial clinical trial data management system. We have detailed software development lifecycle and validation processes for our bespoke software as well. And then we also have a software development lifecycle that we've created when we do our validation packages for our data collection instruments. Our relationship, again, from Frontier Science, University of Wisconsin, dates back over 20 years, probably closer to 30 or 40. And we provide, for several projects, data management, database setup and monitoring. We do some auditing work as well as site monitoring for numerous projects. Invested is one example where Kim was the PI of the Data Coordinating Center. We provided the data management and the monitoring work for that. Under Nasia Saptar Recover study, we provided the data management and monitoring for that. And then our two newest projects is a coordinating center for the Cancer Prevention Clinical Trials Network, sponsored by the NCI from the Division of Cancer Prevention. Cumin's the PI of that. We provide the data management on reporting and auditing for that project. And then our newest project that we're still celebrating together is that we were awarded recently a coordinating center for the HIV and cervical cancer prevention network, also sponsored by the NCI Division of Cancer Prevention, called the Cascade Network. That project's just getting off the ground. So you'll see a close collaboration for many, many years built on the roots, excuse me, of frontier science that we've carried through on several new projects. Now I want to, excuse me, get into our validation areas and rationale for the current presentation today. So I'd first like to focus on validating data collection instruments for the purposes of this presentation. Now there's various areas of validation, and starting with system validation. So many of you maybe know data collection instruments from the purpose of, what's taking so long if you're developing a study, and maybe you don't have an appreciation for what's involved. So when you start with a system validation, and again, Frontier itself has built EDC systems or remote data collection systems, but the landscape has changed in that most projects are now licensing commercial software, or maybe your institution has a product like REDCap. So to start off, you have to validate that system. And there's a vendor validation of that system if you're using a commercial system, and there's also user validation. And then after you validate the system, there's a system configuration where you configure the system for fit for purpose of your data collection instruments. And then there's also a study build validation. And then within that, there's obviously data collection instruments. So again, we're going to focus on just the data collection part of this, but I did want to point out that there's validation areas for all four of these main areas of data validation. And to start off is, why do we validate? And how I've always approached this and look at this is that we validate because we have to, and then we validate because we want to. So starting with the have to is there's obviously regulations and authorities, such as when using electronic trial data handling or remote electronic data systems. The sponsor, the authorities say that you have to ensure that the document in electronic data processing systems conforms to the requirements for completeness, accuracy, reliability, and consistent intended performance. This is in fact validation, and it's governed by ICH GCP E6R2. There's also 21 CFR Part 11. There's a FDA guidance paper on computerized systems used in clinical trials. And then there's good clinical data management practices, the GCDBMP. And so that's obviously there's regulatory rules and authorities and guidelines that need to be followed. But the why we validate is also because we want to validate. As good researchers, we want data integrity, we want data quality, we want data completeness so we can carry out our aims, our scientific objectives of our protocols and studies. And we want this done with integrity, quality, and data completeness. And so moving on to the system validation, I'll give an overview of each one of these, and then I'll zero in more on the data collection importance of that validation specifically. But for the system validation, this includes, again, I'm referencing a clinical trials data management system at your institution. It could be REDCap, it could be various other EDCs, but this includes the electronic data capture system or whatever system you're using itself. So this is, you're actually validating this system. And if you're licensing it, it already should have come with it. The vendor should have done developer validation. And then there's configurable systems under the GMP category 4, and then user validations referred to as commercial off-the-shelf validation. And so as a foundation Frontier, when we license a system, it comes with the developer validation, but then we have to do what's called COTS validation. And so we do a rigorous validation of the system itself. And again, some examples of CTMSs and EDCs here, I give Metadata Rave, REDCap, which is an academic version that I know all of you have in Wisconsin. There's also a cloud version. Open Clinica is another system. There's Encore, there's various systems. And so to even start, you have to make sure that the system's validated. And then there's validations of the configuration setup of the system for the individual organization. Now, most of you, if you have a system already at your institution, this work has already been done. And then the only thing you need to do is keep up on it if it up versions or whatnot. And again, there's validation at the system level, whether you build your own system or whether you license a system. And now moving on to the study build validation, which is at the core of most of our work. So what's the purpose of the study build validation? So our data collection instruments, and again, these are that collect data required by the protocol of interest or the medical research study. Most of you may know these as case report forms. And then of course, once you get them into the system, they become electronic case report forms, or they could be patient reported outcomes such as ePros. And so I'll focus on, what most people collect data in is an electronic case report form or patient reported outcomes. And what the study build validation ensures is that the data collection instruments are tied to the correct visit. The numbers of visits are correct, such as the visit schedule. Unexpected events roll out with the correct data collection instrument, such as adverse events. Edit checks and queries are triggered as expected. And then your access permissions are correct. And then of course, there's additional validation on top of that. If you're following any kind of standard, either dictated by your protocol or by the grant, such as CDISC, if you have to create standard data tabulation model data sets, and doing any kind of data exchanges or mechanisms. And then there's validations of other capabilities such as reports, randomization setup, or various data exports. And so the summary of this slide is that your study build validation is going to assure that things are correctly set up in the system that you've already validated, and it's working according to your plan. The validation process. So first, to start off, is that a validation process, this is your overarching process at your institution to do any of your validation work. So this will ensure that your data collection instruments are fit for their intended purpose. So you describe in your organization or institution standard operating procedures and work instructions. This is how your team carries out your validation process. And then it also describes your approach to study build, development, and validation. And it obviously needs to include not only new study setup, but also change control provisions. And it explains what deliverables you produce as part of your process. So this is the first step in any kind of clinical trial data management or study build, or even if you're just building one data collection instrument, you need to have a validation process for your work that governs to make sure that your collection instruments are fit for their intended purpose. And the deliverables, again, there's variations of this, but what we've sort of boiled this down to in our organization is that we have a validation. So after the overarching validation process, we have a validation plan, and this is one per study. And then there's a requirements and specification documents. There's a testing plan, a testing report, and a validation report. And I'll go through each one of these in detail. But ultimately, to prove that you have done validation according to your process, these are the deliverables that actually state the evidence that you have done so. Moving into the validation, the process overview, there's various areas. One would be requirement gathering. So this actually determines your data required by protocol. So obviously you're building good CRFs. You want them to capture the data required by the protocol. You also scope out your required edit checks and queries. You consider any regulatory requirements, you document these requirements, and then you review and approve of these final data collection instruments. So like many of us at Frontier Science, which is the data management, a lot of this happens further upstream where you have investigators involved in the CRF construction process and several other team members that approve and finalize those CRFs. And once that's done, you go into your developing your test cases based on your requirements. You do your user acceptance, which is also known as UAT. You execute these test cases, you note any deviations, and you document your test results. Again, you're following your validation process. And this is just an overview of that. And then provided all of your test passes, you're now ready to deploy. So you basically deploy your documents. You have your documents ready, and then you invite your site users into your study build, into your clinical trials data management system. So that's just an overview of the process. Here's another way of looking at it, that you have your data collection instrument review and approval that usually happens with your investigators. Everyone's putting together what the CRFs or case report form should look like, or your particular ePro. And then once you have your requirements, you're going to build and you're going to document these requirements. You're going to then go into user testing, acceptance testing. You're going to complete your testing report, and you're ultimately going to deploy and produce your validation report. Now, your validation plan. So the validation plan, remember I said there's one per study. This essentially lays out for your team members and the respective responsibilities, what is their role in the process? Everybody has a task, and what's their role? It describes how the study build is going to be validated, and it describes how you will capture objective evidence of testing, and it's going to summarize your overall study risk. So again, it's a key deliverable. It's one per study, and it's the first step in the validation process. As far as the requirements in testing, there's specifications and requirements. These are going to list all the user specification requirements, expectations for the study build, and the data collection validation based on inputs from the users, the protocol. It could involve regulatory needs for the study, the data collection workflows between the entities. And so these are going to be another deliverable where you have your specifications and requirements laid out in a document. Then you're going to, after you have your constructed case report form, if that's your data collection instrument or your ePro, you're going to then set out to put together a testing plan. And this is going to include all of your test cases. So you write test cases for your requirements, and I'm actually going to show you how to do this. You're going to then outline your expected results, what your test cases should cover. There's multiple scenarios to ensure that the case report forms or your ePro rolls out and that the edit checks work as intended. And then you need to approve this plan prior to actually executing in the UAT environment. And then what you'll have finally is your testing report, and this will have your test cases, your actual results, any defects or resolutions, if applicable, and then your evaluation. All of this has to be in place and documented before you actually deploy the study build into production. Now, your validation report, this actually summarizes all activities as described in your validation plan. It was completed as planned. It explains any deviations in the process set forth in the validation plan. An example of this might be, for whatever reason, you decide that because the build's taking a long time and you're getting pressure by the team, maybe you want to not roll out year one visit. You want to just focus on the entry visit. And so you could deviate, but you'd have to document it, and then you'd have to then ultimately add that visit in later. So you can deviate from the process. It's set up for that because obviously research, things happen in research in the clinical trials or study landscape. So you need to make sure that your process is flexible and nimble enough to deal with changing and things outside of your control. It also contains approval for production deployment. Several people out there may have a separate deployment report, or it could be included in the validation report like we do at Frontier Science. Again, it's another key deliverable. And then if we move on now to the data collection instrument validation itself. So again, starts with your developing a case report form. If your clinical case report form requirements come from regulatory requirements, where the site PI might be able to execute a signature. There's protocol requirements that help design that form. There's edit checks where the form must signify if the site enters an incorrect value. The data management plans involved in governing the data collection instrument, and then there's instructions. So all of these requirements come from various documentation that helps someone set out to do the study build. Some examples of edit checks. So after you construct your data collection instrument, you'll have such as missing values. You need to be prepared for fields where data is always expected. You impose a check if blank. You specify requirements if the field cannot be blank. There's range checks, obviously, that are built, and there's test cases that make sure that the range checks are being met in your clinical trials or EDC system. There's logical inconsistencies. These are more intuitive. They take some experience to identify and configure. So these do take some time to sit through and think about all the various test cases in your UAT. And then there's cross-form checks, again, getting more complex as you go through. These programming for these checks is more complex, where you need a form in there before you launch another form, such as an adverse event is listed as a reason for termination, but you're missing the actual adverse event form. And then protocol violations. These may require additional tracking or attention during the study. So these are really just after you build the CRF, there's examples of edit checks that you write, and all of these have test cases associated with it. So now we're going to actually get into where, after I talked about the process, the various levels of configuration, what's involved deliverable wise. So if we were to set out to do this and not being familiar, what you're looking at on the screen is just a paper copy of a case report form. This is just a simple off-study case report form for the purpose of this presentation. And you'll see, I pull out 2 questions, and question 1 says it's the date of the last protocol data collection time point. It's expecting a date. And then question 3 says, based on the description above, where it actually asks for the primary reason why a participant may be discontinuing the study. But question 3 is asking for that code from a list of why the participant discontinued the study. So these are 2 questions that we're going to take you through and actually attempt to write a test case on this and show you how the evidence of your validation is obtained. And so this is that same form highlighting the 2 questions of interest. Obviously, as I said earlier, you would do a test case, at least 1 for each question. Some questions have multiple test cases. We're simplistically just looking at 2 questions for the purpose of this. This is exactly what the paper form would look like in an EDC system. EDC systems obviously vary on their screen, on how they render in a screen, but this is basically typical on how a data entry screen would look. So this first thing is date of last protocol data collection time point. And then again, based on the description above, we're going to be choosing a code. So here's how example requirements turn into how you're going to then create traceability matrices and make sure that your requirements render the exact expected result. So if you look at R1.2, which is third of the way down. So the first requirement I should point out is that this is the last visit data collected. Again, going back, it's saying the last protocol date of collection time point. So this is our first requirement, and expected result is there's a question collecting the last date of data collection for the participant. And your second requirement would be that the date that's inputted obviously needs to be a valid date. And so the date's collected in the format of the valid date. What we're writing a case for, we're jumping to this number 2, is date is not in the future. And so I'm going to show you how we actually write a test case to actually say the date's not in the future and how we execute that test case and then capture the evidence of that. So date is not after today's date. And then for that second question, based on the description above, choose the code from the primary reason the subject discontinued. Again, we have here the reason the code collected. There's a question collecting the reason, and then valid discontinuation code use. So each question has a requirement and expected result. Some of them have multiple. So taking this through, here's an example test case for this very simple scenario. So first of all, you have your form name and test, you have to name everything. So we have a very simple convention. We use the form name, and it's this test 1. So this is saying every requirement must be verified by at least 1 test. So every question needs to have 1 test executed. Again, 1 test may verify multiple requirements. So in our test objective here, we're going to verify R1, again, going back, R1 date's not in the future. So when we look here in question 1, we're going to enter tomorrow's date. It should not allow us to do this, and we're going to verify this. So our expected result when we write out our testing plan is we expect an error message to say that you can't have a future date. It's not permitted. So whoever's executing the test per the plan is going to, we put a plan together. Whoops, getting ahead of myself here. The testing plan is going to describe the testing process. It's going to list the test cases that will be completed. Again, we're only going to go through 2, but each test case is going to list the requirements being tested and expected results. And then these all need to be approved prior to UAT testing. And then you execute your test cases. So you can't start unless you actually think through, if you look at the case report form or the data collection instrument, you need to think through all the tests associated with all the requirements. You put that all in the plan. This is just also showing the SOP, and it's showing that we actually have a list of all the test cases. Once you're satisfied with that, you then set out to actually do the test case and have someone execute it. So again, going back to that question that we're doing in requirement 1, we didn't want a future date. So we expect an error message displayed if somebody was to put in tomorrow's date. And you'll see here, this is just a typical screenshot. You'll see here that this test case passed because we expected an error to say that you cannot have a date in the future. So this is just a simple explanation of taking a requirement through and creating that traceability matrix. And again, this is a very simple way of showing you this on one question, but you can imagine that most data collection instruments have numerous questions, have numerous scenarios. So the testing can be very involved. We could have up to 100 tests, maybe multiple of that on one case report form. And then of course, if you're talking about a whole study build, there could be thousands. So your evidence of testing is you need an objective evidence that all the requirements have been fulfilled by the software or the computer system. And in this case of study build, your evidence of your eCRF testing, which is again, is the CRF inside the data collection system, testing is going to consist of the following artifacts. Now at Frontier, we mostly use screenshots, and that's what I actually showed you here. This is an actual screenshot that we actually then capture and we show as our evidence. Others times, there has been some video recording that also will satisfy the requirements of evidence. You could also use an audit trail. There's could be signed acknowledgement that testing was performed. Sometimes different organizations use two people testing at the same time, and they then document that. And basically, where you prove your evidence of testing is you explain whatever you set out to do in your validation plan is what you then need to do as you're executing your test cases. So again, most people are using screenshots, but these are other ways that you can actually document that evidence. And then your testing report. So once your testing plan's in place and you start writing your test cases, this is going to list all the test cases that were completed, the results of each test case, and all the issues encountered that were addressed. All your test cases have to pass, or at least have to deem if they are acceptable failures. This is a very rare event, but I did give an example early on where maybe at the last minute you made an executive decision that you needed to short circuit the study build, and you document that reasons why, as long as that's done up front and you note that. And then you're going to map each test case to its associated requirement. So this is called a traceability matrix. So you then can show evidence that you have your study requirement, you have your test case that was executed as planned. And then when all of this is done, the testing report is final and signed off on, you can actually study build can now be deployed for use in the field. I mentioned before that, not to overcomplicate, but there are deviations in testing. There's going to be a defect log to capture all the issues that occur, and it's part of the testing report. And some examples here, again, when you're doing a study build, some things could be outside of your control, but you have to document. If an edit check, for example, doesn't trigger, you have to decide, are you letting this go and you'll fix it on an upgrade, or are you need to stop and go back to square one to do your testing? So these are things that, an experienced study build group will go through. Again, it follows your validation process of what authorities have to make these executive decisions. And these all have to be documented as evidence of your testing. As far as deployment, so after your testing report is finalized and approved, the study build can be deployed to production environment. The approval of your deployment can be documented. Again, as I said before, it's either documented in your validation report, which is what we do, or there's some organizations that have a standalone deployment report. And then you deploy the study build to production in your EDC or clinical trials data management system, and you make it accessible to appropriate users. And again, your validation report, your end deliverable, is going to validate that you followed your process, you've written your requirements, your specifications, you've conducted your testing and your UAT development, you have your required sign-offs, all your testing has passed. If you feel comfortable and that your validation is complete, you can actually launch this into study build production. And like any good process, focusing on to get a new study off the ground with your data collection instruments, whether you're building a whole study or maybe just doing one CRF, one case report form, one ePro survey, you still have to follow your validation process. You have to have your deliverables that we went through, but you also have to have change control process. And this means whether you're doing one CRF or a whole build, changes obviously in clinical trials or medical research studies are going to come. And when they do, You may have to version your data collection instruments. Maybe you're up versioning them to add a field or take away a question. This will affect your validation deliverables. And so you have to assure that the changes are reflected in your standard forms. And you may have to go back and execute some test cases. And again, document your change control process on all the effective forms based on that modification to the protocol or change. And then, of course, there's additional testing based on risk. And this just shows that if a protocol undergoes a change, you have to determine the impact on the study build, do a risk assessment, you revise certain forms, you have to go through the process again, although it's simplistic, obviously, than doing a whole new study build. You test your changes, and then if you're ready, you redeploy. And a big data center like ourselves, where we're involved in multiple networks, there's obviously time involved in a study build or even producing one CRF. There's a lot of paperwork. We've tried to streamline all of this with signatures. We do rely on some commercial products to help us along the way. We've gone through a lot of audits, and our systems have been very successful in helping us prove that we have evidence of this validation. But we also have created a lot of global libraries, which is a standard collection of case report forms or data collection instruments. And once the validation has been done on these and the test cases are in place, you can reuse these with not having to write additional test cases or additional edit checks. So there's efficiency gained on reuse of forms. If you can prove that that form was already validated before, you can then use it in your study build. If you make a slight change, that's where the change control process goes in. So you can rely on prior testing of standard forms and edit checks in your new study. Again, in closing, your validation deliverables, again, you need that validation overarching process. Your deliverables are basically your evidence that you followed your organization validation process. So again, there's the validation report or the validation plan. There's your requirements and specifications, and then there's your testing plan, what you set out to do. Then there's your testing report, and then your validation plan of your deployment. So these deliverables are stored with your study's essential documents. And again, if there's any change that happens, you start the process, the iterative process over again and collect that evidence. And with that, I will close with, again, thank you for inviting me. If you haven't already had an appreciation of the importance of the data collection instrument validation or the time involved and the task involved, hopefully you do now. And I'd like to just give also a thank you to Adele Ahmad, who runs our programming division, who helped with the content, and Alex Krylikowski, who helped with the formatting of the presentation. So thank everybody for listening, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Okay, it looks like we have some questions in the chats. My question is, how often are university partners practicing similar levels of validation CRF Part 11 compliance?
Right. And so, I know that everyone that when Frontier collaborates with someone, we certainly, especially in clinical trials, as well as these guidelines and regulations also govern observational studies as well. They're all under the same rigor as far as validating your data collection instruments. We certainly have to do it at Frontier Science because we're under the audit microscope a lot. Institutions, I've worked with partners before where the level of validation probably isn't where it needs to be. I think people do great work, and they are doing levels of testing. This is what I've seen personally. They're doing a lot of levels of testing, and they're actually carrying out a lot of this. But unfortunately, if you don't document it, right, you cannot prove it's happening. So really, most institutions that I work with do almost all of this. They just don't document it to the level of rigor that it needs to be documented. And so, in creating your evidence. So I see people put together surveys and they do chaos testing and they test beyond belief. But unless you actually record your testing by screenshots and you execute your test case and you can do traceability matrices, upon an audit, you're going to have a hard time proving that you actually have that required evidence. And so a lot of our work are actually working with institutions to help them get up their level of validation. Again, most are doing it. It's just we help them, we advise them on, getting that process in place. And you don't always have to use fancy tools, I should say. We do rely on a lot of commercial products. We use Agility to help with our test cases. Back in the day, a long time ago, people just used, Word, they used Excel. The guidelines do not dictate that you have to use these fancy, complicated systems. They just dictate that you have to have evidence that you're following whatever process you've adopted. And so, I feel that many institutions in this line of work, as I said before, we all, as investigators, want good data integrity, we want accuracy, and we want data completeness. And so, we set out to do that. It's really more people fall short in actually being able to document evidence that they actually have done that.
Thank you. I see you're unmuted, Dr. Matsumura. Did you have a follow-up?
No, that was my question. And I think Sue's right. In my lab, we are frequently audited. So we know all about screenshots and documenting and version control. But it does have, I want to emphasize, this might have seemed like a boring topic to some clinical investigators, but this is fundamental research science. And if you do this right, you will save so much time later sorting out why is the date of death before the date of randomization and stuff like that. This is really fundamental scientific practice that I think we should all be practicing.
Right. And I should actually add, I kind of said it because I wear both hats, right? I'm on the side of, I ask even my own internal group, why is this taking so long? Like, we want to open up this protocol, we got to get going here. It's a COVID protocol, it's a monkeypox trial. What's taking so long? But, you're right. I mean, there's certain things you can short circuit, but you need to have this level to make sure that you have your, data integrity and accuracy and whatnot. So you do actually have to do all these steps. There's certain efficiencies that can be gained if you're good at doing these and you can work in parallel, but you really can't skip any part of the process. You're not going to do very well in an audit. And even if you're not, it's not always about, it's almost like, testing to pass the test or teaching to pass the test, right? It's not always about that. As I said before, I think all of us in the research arena want to do good work. We want to write that publication that's based on sound, accurate data. And so that's enough of a drive to, you want reproducible results. And so that governs a lot of this as well.
There's an excellent question from Ann Buffington.
Okay, I see. Oh, I'm sorry, Ann, I missed your question. So what advice do you have for those working in small research labs? There is little programming and validation support, and we're using REDCap for the EDC. What are the key takeaways that are applicable in this setting where there's perhaps not as much time or resources for rigorous and well-documented validation, but we still want to ensure CRFs are reliable?
Yeah, that's an excellent question.
So go ahead.
It's actually an excellent question. It's one of the reasons why I picked this topic, right? Because we work with a lot of university partners and they do great work, especially if it's like a smaller R01. It's not a huge network. It's just an R01 study or a smaller grant mechanism. And as I said before, I think that, even without programming and sophisticated software commercial systems, you still actually could sit down and we advise on a lot of these areas at Frontier. It's sort of sitting down and coming up with a validation process, right? Like, so if you're just designing one ePro questionnaire or one CRF, we just went down this road with our partners at UCLA. They were just doing one CRF. They had no validation process in place. So we put a process in place, we basically outlined who's doing what, right? Who's putting the CRF together. And then for all the questions, you have to have at least one test case, right? So when you design a CRF, if it's asking for the weight, and it's in a, so you then are constructing well, you don't expect somebody to weigh 1,000 pounds. You don't expect someone to weigh 10 pounds. And so you construct your test. Again, you can use Excel, you can use Word. The fact is you're constructing a test and you're then showing someone as somebody tests it to make sure it's a CRF, and you make sure that the range or whatever question it is, you just have to prove that your CRF works as intended. It's fit for purpose. And you actually are collecting evidence, but it can be done by just using tools such as Excel. You could have a requirement in Excel and you can say, okay, this person, my data manager ran this test they put in a future date, it didn't work, the edit fired. And then you go through your process and, you have a sign off where someone on your team is signing off that you have a test case for each requirement. And then you then sign off that it's executed. So it can be done even with a minimal staff. I think it's just getting a process in place that's going to work. A lot of institutions use REDCap. It's a very good system. And you can certainly easily follow a validation process within REDCap. Usually your institution will do the system configuration. They'll do the system validation. So you don't have to worry about that. But if you're the team executing a study build or building one data collection instrument, there's where you'll have to adopt some kind of validation process. And there's templates online. I mean, Frontier has templates. It's really just, coming up with those. And I will share with you, years ago, I mean, I've been at Frontier for 30 years. And so everyone didn't always do this, right? I mean, they still did good work, but the whole evidence in that came, well into where people were doing all of this. And, when we first rolled this out, a lot of our programmers and even statisticians felt like, whoa, this is a lot of paperwork. This is a lot of sign off. This is a lot of paperwork. It's taking me away from what I want to do. But like I think someone said, Dr. Mazamora, that it's really worth it. If you go through a couple of audits or you have studies and you have a problem, you can do a traceability matrix and really trace back where the root problem is. And so it's really worth the investment. And you don't have to make it overcomplicated, especially if you're not building, multiple studies. You still can do really good work, even if you only build a couple CRFs a year by having a good validation process.
Great. And you answered the second part of the question, which was, are there template validation plans? So you said they're on your website, and Kelly has very helpfully added the Frontier Science website to the chat.
Well, I'm not saying they're online. There's variations online. We don't necessarily put ours in the public domain. They're very customized to our trials. We certainly could give advice if anybody, especially we have a close-knit collaboration with Wisconsin right now. And so, we certainly can answer questions. I have a team of experts and we collaborate on various projects. So we can certainly, if someone wants to show us their validation plan or process, we can certainly take a look at that.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. A next question is, are adverse events typically allowed as free text or limited to a list of possible values?
Yeah, so in the data management, there's just good data collection, right? Like if you in Cumin as a statistician, I'm sure there's other statisticians, you can collect anything you want in text. You're going to have to deal with misspellings and you're going to have to deal with, reporting is not necessarily efficient way of doing it. Usually you'll have a code and then you'll also have a text that complements that code. So on the back end, the statistician's not recoding. But as far as the form construct, and if you're actually applying standards like CDISC and CDASH, they actually do have codified data inputs as well as text. You usually see both. You don't just see one.
Are there other questions? No, and Cumin just put in CTCAE or MEDRA.
Yep, and MEDRA actually, there's the MEDRA coding dictionary, the terminology, that's actually coded right off text, but there's also corresponding codes. But we code right off of text for that specified fields, depending on what terms you're using.
Any other questions from anybody today?
This is Youngman Kim. I just want to make a comment. Because of the, oftentimes limited budget and the lack of adequate funding, data management, including the validation that is required, is the last thing the investigators think about. The problem is that as a statistician, I have to pick up the pieces and, take care of the mess. That's what I oftentimes see when there was no proper validation. And it's just a waste of, you may save a little at the beginning, and you will expend a lot at the end. As Dr. Matsumura mentioned earlier, you'd like to take care of these data management issues upfront because the cost of cleaning up is so much greater and so unpleasant. And those of you who's been around on this campus for a long time, Dr. Carbone used to say that data doesn't age as well as the wine. And what he was saying is that you have to take care of the data quality issues up front instead of waiting at the end. And this validation help you get there much more efficiently.
Sue, are there common errors that you come across that maybe you could just kind of give the audience a heads up so they can be aware of that when they're putting together their instruments?
Yeah, I think, I think it's, I mean, there's obviously good practices in creating a really good data collection instrument, clear skip logic, clear questions and codes and whatnot. But what I feel is an error is I feel sometimes people are just overwhelmed. Like, I don't have enough resources. I'm overwhelmed. I can't do all this. Like, even I just told you need at least 5 deliverables. I think that alone is like, what? That's a lot of paperwork. But I think if you really look at, and I tried to just go through a simple question. I mean, like I said, some of our study builds for the AIDS clinical trials group, we have hundreds and hundreds of test cases, right? But there's a lot of reuse in our work because we're using standard forms. If you're an institution and you have a couple ePros or a few CRFs, or even if it's one study build, I think to spend some time in saying, well, if we had a validation process, because again, I really am convinced that a lot of institutions are doing this, they just don't have a way to document the evidence. And so you're already halfway there. It's really just sitting together and coming up with a validation process, like who in your team is doing what. And obviously you don't want the same person building as testing. It's just like, so you have to separate that. But I really think most of the overwhelmness comes from not building, not designing a bad CRF, because I think that, that's relatively a straightforward process. There's templates out there. There's CDASH, which is CDISC way of having you develop a good CRF. But it's really just sitting down and saying that, we all want good data. We all want to construct a good CRF, and we all want to analyze data. So it's coming up with that validation process, right? And that should be your approach. And there's definitely flexibility there. I mean, the guidelines don't dictate exactly what should be in there. They tell you you need an approach, and they tell you you have to follow it. And then you have to show evidence that you're actually testing your requirements, which essentially requirements is your question on that data collection instrument. And so if you think it through and spend a little bit of time on your process, it's actually, if you break it down, it's not that bad. Okay. Because a lot of the institutions, like I said, we just had an institution, they're just like, I'm not doing all this for one CRF. I just have to whip out a survey, and it's going to be in REDCap. It's going to be easy. It's during COVID. It's easy. But you technically, you need to validate that. And so we helped them do that. And now they're actually empowered and energized, because now they're thinking like, wow, I can apply the same thing to every single CRF I build. Yes, you can. It's the same thing over and over again. It's your test cases and your requirements. So I think it's really just sitting down and thinking through that validation process and curtailing it to your organization, to your team members, and like you said, some of the R01s aren't going to fund. You're not going to get a whole department. You're going to get 1 or 2 people. They're going to wear multiple hats, right? And so who on your team is doing what, and kind of going through. And again, don't get caught up. My advice, don't get caught up in that you have to license commercial fancy tools to keep track of everything. Like if you're not like, we build hundreds and thousands of forms, we have to have tools or we're going to not be efficient. But on some institutions, if you're using REDCap, you still can use Excel, very powerful. You can keep track of your requirements in Excel. You keep track of your test cases. It's all possible to do this. And so you can start out like that. And then as you go, and the more studies you get, the more projects you get, maybe you look at it. Do I need a commercial tool to help me with this? Maybe the answer is no, maybe the answer is yes. It kind of depends what you're doing and how you're evolving. But, I would just start by breaking it down and getting that validation process and understanding, and most of your team members, they want a good CRF, they want a good product, right? As Cuman says, you need to spend a little bit of time on the front end. And I think you're going to get a lot of return on investment on the back end.
Right. And Cuman has put in the chat, don't create a CRF from the ground up, and that ICTR has a lot of CRFs and REDCap that they've made available. So don't read, I think is the take home message.
Right. And remember, I said during the presentation, and we call it a global library, but if your institution has an installation of REDCap, you know, if somebody validates a generic form and they've written the test cases and they've executed them and they've passed and they have evidence, then if you come along and you're using that form as is, you don't need to repeat that process. You know, in your study validation plan, you say you're using a generic form that's been tested and has evidence already associated with it. That's where you gain efficiency, especially with an institution like yourself, that you have a REDCap installation and you probably do have somewhat of a case report form library. You know, you make a change to it, you just have, and the rest of the form is documented and you have evidence of that, then you just have to basically, you know, validate that change. And so that's where you can gain some efficiency and it won't be such an overwhelming task.
Any other questions from the audience?
So any questions? I mean, my email address is there. I have a team of people, like I said. I mean, we have a great history working with Cuman and Nasia and other people at the university. We'd be happy to give some advice. Any of you that are interested in some advice, you can certainly contact us. And I know that there's a few announcements I could, you know, after this as well. But again, thank you for having me. You know, this work is near and dear to us, and we try to make it as efficient as possible because we know that investigators are eager once they do finalize that protocol, they want to get it out to the field. So we do our best to kind of, you know, make sure we're following all the rules and regulations and able to, you know, have a nice, mean, lean process that we can actually conduct really good quality work.
Thanks so much, Sue. I mean, this was so helpful, such good information. Before everybody logs off, I just want to make a couple quick announcements. Our next CT Community of Practice will be the end of January, and we're going to hear from 2 researchers at Marshfield Clinic that have been using Facebook to recruit for research studies. So, you know, this is definitely an upcoming trend in using social media. So we definitely want to hear how they did that successfully. And Sue, if you could move one more slide. Thank you so much. Also, just want to give a plug for the multi-site research team in ICTR. Myself and Allie Moeller, my colleague, are here to work with you. If you're interested in working with various health networks, we have a Wisconsin-based network called Winner, and then a upper Midwestern-based group called March. So if you're looking to have multiple sites for your studies and expand your reach beyond Madison, please contact us and let us know. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thank you, Sue, for a wonderful presentation.
Yep. Thank you too, Cuman, and all your colleagues. It's nice to meet everybody. Have a wonderful rest of the day.